I've had the opportunity on multiple occasions to speak to the CMG group, albeit the first time virtually, but a pleasure nonetheless. So today we're going to talk about corporate social responsibility through the eyes of the CFO. And what started this, this thought process of looking at corporate social responsibility really centered around the events of last year. As a leadership and business coach, I've always looked at social responsibility as a key element of a leader's role and how they influence the team and the organizations that they lead. Last year, our local chamber had with a new CEO, basically said, we really need to look at social responsibility in a more serious manner, and created a social responsibility committee through the chamber. And so I saw it as an opportunity to essentially advance this idea of what social responsibility is. And so joined up, and I head up their programming committee. And so you'll see, some of this is influenced by just my interest in social responsibility. Part of that came out back in 2012. I was a contributing author to a book called The Common Sense Approach to Sustainability. So it's always been an interest in the sense that every leader needs to be aware of it and needs to practice it. So in this particular case, looking at it through the eyes of the CFO, I thought was an interesting view. And so when we look at what we're going to talk about today, we'll look at, what is it? Just to ground everybody. And I understand we have an audience that's not just in Chicago. So, this will be applicable to pretty much anybody, anywhere, regardless of what type of organization you either work for or want to work for. So, what is it? And of course, more importantly, why do we care? And then we look at, there's a CFO Superpower Shift that is part of this equation, and we'll talk about that. And then as we look at, how do we monetize and measure? What is the measurable value of social responsibility, and more importantly, the different moving parts to social responsibility. So we'll have because of the time, we'll ask a few rhetorical questions, but if questions come up from the audience, then Jerry and Kathy will be at the ready, monitoring the chat, so that if there are any questions, both of them can shout out and say, hey, we have a question, and we should be able to take a couple here as we get through through the conversation, and then be able to leave you with some ideas that you can take back to your organizations. So let's just start with, so what is it? What is social responsibility? It is voluntary best practices embedded in a company's culture and business processes that look at producing a positive impact to society. And so when you look at some of the key words that are in this definition, voluntary, obviously, but more importantly, voluntary best practices. So it's not just doing stuff, it's doing the kind of processes, the kind of ideas, the kind of practices that are truly embedded, not just topically, but embedded. Many years ago, I had the opportunity to be an evaluator for the Malcolm Baldrige Award. And if you're familiar with the process of being part of the Malcolm Baldrige evaluation process, you can't just wake up one day and say, okay, let's put together some best practices, and a month later qualify for something as prestigious as the Malcolm Baldrige Award. You have to show that those best practices are embedded. And that's really what we're talking about here, because probably most importantly, we're looking on what is the impact on society. And it's an important thread that we'll see throughout this conversation, because even at the World Economic Forum that meets in Davos, Switzerland, every couple of years, 2 years ago, they saw the need for their own mission statement to reflect this idea of impact on society. And so they changed their mission statement to reflect this as well. So it's not something that is, I would consider, maybe we thought of it in the periphery, but it is something that is now becoming an integral part of the culture and the very fabric in which organizations run. So another way to look at it is a way that the values of the organization are manifested through just the way they do business, which is really another way to look at, culturally, how does it conduct its business. And one of the myths about corporate social responsibility, and I understand that the audience is primarily mid-market types of organizations, mid-market organizations, but social responsibility is not just for big businesses. It's unfortunate that reputation may have perpetuated itself, because we always hold up the Walmarts and the large corporations as examples of sustainability and DEI and that sort of thing, but it can perpetuate itself across any business, no matter the size. RPC Leadership Associates is basically I'm a solopreneur, but we regularly practice all four elements, which you'll see on the next slide, of social responsibility. Jerry mentioned in my bio that we volunteer. We look at sustainability, even as a small business. If you were able to see my printer off to my right, you'd see a box built. One side is fresh paper and the other side is paper that's been printed on one side. I just recycled, print all my drafts on both sides. So if it's a small thing, but it's still, on the scope and scale of the size of business, it's still a mindset that says we're going to practice social responsibility. So the four areas that categorically make up what social responsibility are you can see here listed on the slide: volunteerism, philanthropy, sustainability, and then diversity, equity, and inclusion. And these are the collaborations that the business community has with, or should have with, their communities. The rest of the I don't want to call it non-business, but the nonprofits, the governmental agency, public, private, large and small. It's these collaborations around these four pillars that really make up the social responsibility idea. And I keep saying social responsibility because, one of the challenges that I think even the name has is this idea of corporate. So this corporate social responsibility, I think, artificially perpetuates this idea that, well, it's only for big corporations, and it's not. And that's a key takeaway from today, is that social responsibility, based on the definitions you saw on the previous slide, are really about how you conduct your business, living your values that are embedded in the culture that promotes the good of society. So let's take a look and break down this idea of what each one of these is. And as we talk about what they are, later on in the presentation, we'll get to how do we show value? How do we measure the value of this particular platform within our business? So volunteerism, giving time for the benefit of other people, without any financial return in kind. We see it a lot, and as you'll see as we talk about the why do we care, you'll see that there's two schools of thought around volunteerism that we'll talk about here in a bit. But it's basically, giving of your time, raising your hand to say, how can we help? From a business context, it's how does the business view volunteerism? How does the business help promote that volunteerism, either procedurally, giving tools, time? What does the culture say about the business's view towards volunteerism? And those are going to be some of the questions that are embedded in your own takeaways as you go back to your business. How do we view that? How do we bake these kinds of things into our culture. So philanthropy, while related to volunteerism, is a bit different. It's more of the umbrella, and I'm sure those in the audience that have that sit on boards have heard the time, talent, and treasure moniker before. It's whatever you have. Obviously, time is self-explanatory. Talent is pretty well self-explanatory, and then of course, treasure means the monetary donation that you're able to provide to the nonprofit that you're working with. I thought it was interesting that just kind of the beginning or the origin of the word philanthropy, love of humanity. I think it's just a good reminder, given the challenges we have in today's society. But it's, when we look at philanthropy vis-a-vis volunteerism, philanthropy is really more of a contribution towards solving long-term problems, helping advance society. I mean, it is definitely something that is, when we look at the nonprofit space, we as a society need the nonprofit world. Society cannot survive and thrive solely based on what the business world brings. And that's why nonprofits exist. They exist to fill gaps in where the business community cannot currently solve those problems. So quick example, I took on a client in San Diego, California, in career transition, got caught up in furloughs and layoffs because of the pandemic last year. And because of my volunteer work and my understanding of what is out there, one of the first things that he didn't even know about, one of the first things I pointed him to was, where's your local community career center that is a nonprofit solely geared to helping those in transition in the local community? And so even as a business person and a business relationship that we were forming, the first thing I helped steer him to was a nonprofit. So this idea of philanthropy and volunteerism is very important in the greater context. Sustainability. We've all heard the term. Once again, I think it's been hijacked, a couple of different ways. Sustainability has been, oftentimes refers to, or people think of, the environmental efforts, climate change, protecting the planet, those sorts of things. But it's basically, in a broader sense, it's meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs as well. And when you think about this, future generations, we have 5 generations that are working in the workplace today. And this will come into play here in the next couple of slides. But, we can't think of future generations as beyond our lifetime. Future generations are here and now. Generation Z just entered the workplace, and the traditionalists are still in play. So we have 5 generations that to varying degrees, but still you have 5 generations that are active in the workplace. And so sustainability, and Jerry mentioned the books that I've written, the Missing Piece series of books all talk about creating sustainable programs, sustainable profit, sustainable success, because it's all about, in my view, in my experience, anybody can create success in one business cycle, and that's good, but greatness is being able to do that in a sustainable way. So, we do think about sustainable profits. We do in economic development. We do think about how do we keep our people developed through this VUCA world, volatility, uncertain, complexity, and ambiguous world that we currently live in. So that's the broader sense of sustainability. And then DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is, there's 3 moving parts to it. And I bring this up because we often confuse we focus on one and not the other. And so, definition of diversity, it's really the presence of differences and include underrepresented populations across practitioners. But one of the key things, and you'll notice there's a very specific reason why I use this diagram. How many of you have said, well, I don't see color, or use the term melting pot? Well, unfortunately, that becomes part of the challenge around diversity. And the melting pot is a very Eurocentric term that was largely part of the last century. But so we look at this, we look at the world through the lens of a mosaic versus a melting pot. And so it's just being able to understand that language of diversity. Equity is really about fairness. Bottom line, fairness within the procedures, the processes, and the distribution of resources across systems. Now, here again, we get confused in this whole idea of social responsibility. Oftentimes, people will talk about equality. Well, equity and equality are very different things. So, and we can, we could spend an hour talking about just DEI in and by itself, but my purpose here is just to orient you to the terminology. Inclusion is where I get, I start my rant when we talk about DEI, because I believe we focus too much on diversity and not enough on inclusion. And you can see the definition here as part of the social responsibility umbrella. It's an outcome when everybody's fully participating in the decision-making and the development opportunities within an organization or a group. And as you can see, it's easy to focus our metrics, if you will, our financial alignment to demographics. They're easy. They're very tangible. You can see the examples: race, location, age, gender. Demographics are quite easy to measure because they're very tangible. But inclusion is really more around psychographics. And if that's a new term that you've not heard, psychographics is really looking at the distribution of attitudes and norms and interests, less tangible, but ultimately more important to the culture of an organization. So just to quickly orient you to the language, if you will, of what we're talking about when we talk about this idea of social responsibility. At this point, Jerry, do we have any questions in the chat before we jump into the next?
Yeah, there was, Rick, more of a couple of general type questions, but to what degree these CSR initiatives align with ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance goals?
It aligns quite well. I mean, ESG is a subset of that corporate responsibility idea. So it all factors into and becomes a part of. And so you look at the 4 planks that I just talked about. You can easily, or I can anyway, see where ESG would fit, into the sustainability, possibly the DEI component of social responsibility.
Okay, and then the follow-on question related to that same author, so to speak, and to what degree agencies such as MSCI and others influence corporations to seek these initiatives beyond voluntarism?
And help me understand what MSCI, just if you could.
I thought that was Museum of Science and Industry, but it doesn't track. I'm not sure. Maybe.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the type of, the acronym stands for. So it's hard to.
The acronym is the Morgan Stanley. It's an index that's used for investing around the world. It's an acronym in the investment world. Okay,
so yeah, great question. So when we talk about investments, it absolutely, there are ETFs, for instance, where we're looking at funds specifically built around the advancement of. One that I'm aware of, the YWCA in metropolitan Chicago has an ETF that helps. So the investment itself helps advance the YWCA's mission of ending racism. And so you look at, there are funds that look specifically at, because sustainability has become such a publicly reported outcome, if you will, then there are funds that are looking at those reports of those companies before they invest. So they're looking at at these areas and what the companies or what the businesses are doing in these areas as part of the investment strategy. This presentation is going to take a look at some of the consumer behavior, but great question around the investment behavior, because they are looking at that as well. I don't know about Morgan Stanley specific, but I know that the investment community is paying more attention to this, and you'll probably see why on the next couple of slides. So let's jump to that. Again, great question. So why do we care? So according to Korn Ferry, the average age of a mid-market CFO, which to my understanding could be representative of the population on this call, is 53. So that puts us at the upper end of Gen X. And because it's an average, one could argue that the younger baby boomers, older Gen Xers would likely make up the lion's share of that population. However, multiple studies have come out and said, the primary driving force behind social responsibility is the initiatives around social responsibility are the millennials, Gen Y. And just so it's always comical sometimes when we talk about the millennials. I do a lot of presentations. I've presented all over the country on generational diversity, and it still amazes me that how many people still talk about the millennials as if they're still kids. So I thought I'd throw this bullet in here just to prove the point that they are the largest generation in the workforce now, but they're the older millennials are 40 years old. They're not kids. Yes, the younger ones and now Gen Z is the generation behind them are starting to come into the workforce. But, you have a decision-making population that is looking at social responsibility, and they're looking at it in earnest. And so because they're the largest population in the workforce, they have major influence. So you almost have this clash of ideas around social responsibility in that the ones that are the population that is measuring the impact or having influence over who cares, is this just a bunch of, group hug kind of, happy, joy kinds of activity, or is there a real business benefit? Because that's what CFOs care about. They want to look at the business benefit. And the millennials are saying, yes, there is a benefit. Let's go back to this idea of volunteerism. As a baby boomer, our generation looked at volunteerism as something we did after we retired. After we got the gold watch, we retired, or at least, stepped out of the traditional corporate gig, and we looked around and said, okay, where can I volunteer? The millennials are volunteering now. That baby boomers and older Xers, their philosophy was we live to work. And baby boomers were actually the ones that created the term workaholic. And so the millennials, they have a very different view. They work to live. And so they're working to enjoy life in their sense. And so you get this idea, they're volunteering now. They're not waiting until they retire and then have time on their hands. They are working that volunteerism, that philanthropy. They want it baked into the workforce culture now. And they have the density of population to influence that. So it's how does the CFO react to that? Well, based on the fact that we have an audience of CFOs, obviously, let's take a look at some numbers. And I pulled this from Babson College's Lewis Institute on Social Innovation, and just some numbers around the value benefit of social responsibility programs at a higher level. Market share, 4 to 6%. Anybody on the call would turn their nose up at 4 to 6% right now? I'm not thinking so. Reducing risk and reducing the cost of debt. So I found that kind of, especially the cost of debt, over 40%. So, there's some very real dollars attached to the benefits from social responsibility. Price premiums. And I thought this graphic said that, highlighted that pretty well. 55% of consumers are willing to pay more for at companies where there's a social conscience, a social responsibility programs, up to 20%. And then, of course, the big one is this idea of staff turnover. And, every CEO knows the cost of turnover within their companies. I know I've been out of the corporate world for 13 years now. But I know we always use anywhere from 130% to 150% of an annual salary as the cost of turnover in the training and the benefits and all the things that go into bringing somebody who's up to speed at the level of the person that left. So there's a very real, and of course, when we talk about staff turnover and reducing staff turnover, again, going back to the millennials, you're talking about a generation that will, if we don't like your culture, we're out of here. Baby boomers and older Xers, if we don't like your culture, we just put our heads down and we just work harder. So it matters in the sense of managing this staff turnover. All right. So let's take a look at this, what I call the CFO Superpower Shift. The traditional view of the CFO role is to focus on the numbers with an eye on the business. And, that's been proven out both in my experience and some of the literature that I continue to read along these lines. But for social responsibility initiatives to truly take hold, the thinking has to change from a focus on the business to a focus on the business with an eye on the numbers. It's a complete reverse. I look at some of the latest literature from Forbes magazine and, some of the industry literature that talks about the evolving role of the CFO. And by the way, it's not just the CFO. We're just talking about that because that's the audience. But HR, IT, many of the supporting roles are going through similar challenges. But this idea that it's not just about the numbers for the CFO. The CFO is we're looking. Do they truly understand the purpose? Do they truly understand the business itself, not just from a number standpoint? So the diagram you see on the slide is called the Batari box. And so when we look at the Batari box suggests, and I run into this a lot as I coach leaders, I'll have a leader that says, well, my team's just they're not getting it. And the first question I ask is, well, what is your role in that? What influence are you having? And I get a puzzled look many times because, they'll say, well, this person has a bad attitude. I said, okay, what is your influence? And if name your employee has a bad attitude, then we have to back up here and say, okay, how is the leader's behavior and more importantly, the leader's attitude influencing that? Oops, sorry about that. What influence are you having on that? And case in point, when I took over as the manager of a team of project managers, the outgoing manager told me and pointed me to a particular employee and said, what, just don't worry about that one. They got one foot out the door. 90 days later, that employee was employee of the quarter. So the point is that as the CFOs change their attitude towards social responsibility, that, if it's not just about the numbers, it's about the business. And when we talk about all the things we talked about on the previous slide, those are all business impacts, not just the numbers. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the balanced scorecard. Balanced scorecard was created because it was a recognition. It's not just about the numbers. There's more to it than that. Social responsibility is part of the culture and part of the expectations of the culture by the workforce that's in power today. So as the attitude of the senior leaders change, so does the behavior, so does the attitude towards social responsibility, in this case, amongst the teams themselves. Another part of this is the metrics that we look at. Traditional metrics look at output, and outputs are lagging indicators. The easiest one, no CFO likes to hear that profit is a lagging indicator, but it is. It's a function of a decision made 90 days ago, give or take. But the real value is in outcomes and impact, because those are more of leading indicators. And you can see on the diagram here where you look at, outputs are merely, the traditional metrics of, okay, we produced 10. Okay, then the outcomes would be, answers the question in order to do what? And then, of course, the impact is the so what. And as I see, and I continue to coach senior leaders, I'm continuously asking, and it doesn't matter whether I'm talking to the CEO, the CFO, COO, doesn't really matter. I'm asking them, so what? What's the impact of that? Because that is where your leading indicator is going to be. And if you have a so what that says we care about social responsibility in whatever fashion you can, you don't have to check all 4 boxes in order to get credit for being socially responsible, because depending on the business and depending on how big or small and how you conduct business, it can start very simply, but ultimately people are looking for the so what. Questions? Any additional questions, Jerry, from the last set?
Not at this point.
Okay, cool. So let's now take a look at what's the value of each of these, and just generate some thinking around, okay, what does this mean? So the obstacle in volunteerism, and okay, well, if they're volunteering, then they're not working. And so how do we overcome that obstacle? So from an employee satisfaction, this sense of belonging, and this is a generation, again, we'll talk about the millennials. Millennials they care about this sense of belonging, and how do they develop their skills? Many times they're not getting their skills developed. You either come to the table with the skills you have, or you're just out of luck. So, volunteerism is a great way for employees to develop new skills. One of the challenges that a generation that grew up looking at or evolve their communications through social media and technology is their face-to-face communication skills aren't all that great. Their ability to read nonverbals, not all that developed. And so in volunteerism, it just gives another way to develop some of those skills. Brand recognition, obviously, what CFO or what leader, period, what business owner doesn't care about their brand in the community? And so how that brand is perceived in the community is, and you measure that by the impact on buying decisions. Oftentimes we ask questions, why did you buy? But I encourage business owners to also ask the question, why didn't you buy? And being able to determine, why are they not buying? And you'll see that in a couple of the other slides as well, that, okay, you can decide to do nothing. You can decide to not have a program, but there's a consequence to that as well. It's not just that they won't buy more, they may actually buy less. And so the brand recognition part of volunteerism in that community is very important. I belong to a leads group in the Naperville Chamber of business-to-business leaders, and we have partnered with a nonprofit for the last 10 years. We now have 3 of our members of the leads group that sit on the board, 2 others sit on their advisory board, and our first fundraiser for that organization raised $5,000. The last fundraiser we had raised over $120,000. So do you think that the community looks at the businesses that participate in that a different way than they would have if they just Googled them and came up business came up in a Google search, I can assure you that they do. So that volunteerism. Philanthropy is, the obstacle here is what is the business using the money for? The problem with philanthropy is we have a misguided and outdated business model in the nonprofit space. Because nonprofits work like any other business. And as I coach nonprofit leaders, it's about a third of my business. We talk about it in very business terms. It's not any different. It's just a business with a special tax status. So using the dollars is measured very much like the donating business themselves. So when businesses say, well, I'm not going to donate to this nonprofit because they're using some of their money for marketing and they're not using it all for the programs themselves. Well, how could you run your businesses if you had no training dollars, no marketing dollars, everything had to go towards your manufacturing and nothing else? So it's this shift, and businesses have a very real impact on helping those nonprofits break through that artificial barrier. And then, of course, measuring the impact of dollars donated, not the cost of the activities that dollars supported. And I'll give you a quick example. I sat on the board of Literacy to Page, which is an adult literacy organization. And when we went out to businesses to talk about the vision and mission, we didn't talk about that $15 buys a picture book that helps an adult start whose native language is something other than English, start to learn English. What we talked about was the impact. A.T. Kearney had run a study that said for every dollar invested in adult literacy, that community returns $33 back. So when you think of a 33-to-1 return, then that's the impact we talked about. And that's why we were able to get philanthropic dollars donated, because we talked about impact. We didn't talk about activities. All right, sustainability. Here's where we get into the sustainability is only beneficial to large companies. Not so much. So I'll just give you a quick example of, regardless of what your personal view is on climate change, here are the facts. Nearly 3/4 of American consumers base their buying decision on a business's activity relating to climate change, both ways. If you do have, then I think the number was 76% will favor somebody who has a climate change related viewpoint. 73% will not buy from a company that doesn't. And so you can see another statistic from a different source, 50 to 80% increase in profits over a 5-year period, or a decrease because they refuse to buy or buy less, can also produce a decrease in profits just by doing nothing. So this idea of sustainability, again, we have personal views about what that might mean, but there are very real dollars and cents associated with a sustainability program. And then last but not least, this is where I've seen in the marketplace, we have too much focus on diversity, not enough focus on inclusion. And here's why. Now, this comes from Juliet Bork wrote a book. It's called Which Two Heads Are Better Than One? And it's about diversity and inclusion. And, these are the numbers she quotes in the book and I've seen these in different places in the research as well. Inclusive organizations 3 times more likely to be high performing, but here's even a bigger number. Better business outcomes, 8 times more likely to achieve business outcomes than non-inclusive organizations. I had the opportunity to work with a chemical company down in Louisville, Kentucky, and we weren't talking about diversity and inclusion, but we were talking about something else. But one of the things they were struggling with was coming up with fresh ideas to advance the business. And so I look across the room. Now, this was the Southeast sales region. And I look across the room and I see 50 white men over the age of 50. The only 2 females in the room were both admin assistants, and there was nobody of color. And the CEO is sitting there out loud saying, we can't come up with any new ideas. And as politely and professionally as I could, try to help him see that the answer was obvious, because there's no fresh ideas. Matter of fact, I kidded him afterwards that the only fresh ideas or the only diversity in the room was which SEC football team they rooted for. And that was pretty much it. And so this idea of inclusion has very real metrics associated with. You can monetize this and obviously the other programs, but every program, every part of this can be monetized. And that's part of the attitude of the CFO, is to not say, well, that can't be monetized or measured, so we're going to disregard it. No, it can be. I'll leave you with a quick story on back when I was a lieutenant, just graduated from West Point with a bachelor's degree in civil engineering. I was sitting at an officers club with a recent graduate from William & Mary who had an English degree. And we spent 4 hours talking about the fact that what can be measured and what can't be. And so I still carry today with this idea that everything can be measured. I just need to get everybody to agree on the scale, whether it's emotions, whether it's ideas, whatever the case may be. And I think that's part of the mindset that has to be embraced, is that there are very real metrics to social responsibility. And it's the CFO that's going to be the center of that conversation. Any questions?
Rick, how do you see these metrics and the measurement? How do you see these getting into people's, say, annual performance evaluations or performance objectives? Are you seeing, and is that any size company, or do you see more from the larger companies?
Well, I'll start off by saying, if you're struggling with metrics in general, my question to you is, do you really understand how your business works? Metrics are merely a way to quantify visible behavior, and it's behavior that drives results, right? So if you don't know the behavior that is generating the outcome, then yes, you're going to struggle with metrics. But once you understand the puts and takes, if you will, that diagram I showed on the previous slide, inputs, processes, outputs, outcomes, and impact, once you start to know what goes into each of those stages, then you can start to create metrics. And the other piece of it is, the metrics don't have to be precise. They just have to be directionally correct to be able to give you a sense that, hey, yes, we're having an impact or we're making a difference. And so, no, I don't think it matters. I don't think it matters what size company you have. And one of the best practices that I've used in the past and that I coach others to use is draw those millennials into the conversation. Help them, guide them, have them as part of the process. What does this look like? And how can we quantify that output so that we can measure impact and measure outcomes, but make them part of the conversation. And I've never seen it, I've never seen it fail, where we get those that do part of the measurement conversation so that we can start to look at, okay, here's the impact that we're really having. I hope that answers the question, but that's typically what I've seen. It's just maybe casting a broader net outside of the traditional metrics that CFOs might be used to.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question. Based on increased emphasis on CSR, how has that changed the skill sets that are most important for a successful CFO?
Great question. It's and it's part of a journey that I myself have even gone through on a personal level. What it's done is back in the day, we used to think of the left brain, right brain. And of course, brain science is now taken us to a point where there is no such thing as left brain, right brain, it's whole brain. So what this has done for the CFOs who traditionally leverage that analytical side of their brain, it has challenged them to step out and advance their emotional side of their brain, the people skills and the like. In the same thread, going back to my lieutenant friend that graduated from William and Mary, for those that think of life more in a esoteric way, it has forced them to be more logical and to look at how do you measure the so what. And so this idea of social responsibility has forced in a good way, force both sides of those that are logical thinkers and those that are more emotional thinkers or creative thinkers to leverage that other half of their brain, so that they're looking at the whole brain, if you will, and bringing both parts of that together to say, here's how we can be creative, and here's how we can show that creativity actually has impact. Great question. As a recovering engineer, I've had to make that journey myself.
And be careful, I'm a physics major undergrad, so I respect engineers. But nonetheless.
One more, Jerry, excuse me 1 second. One more question has come in. When applying to a company nonprofit, how do you suggest highlighting one's diversity value, both in the obvious as well as your experience? And how would a diverse candidate make it through, an ATS system more effectively?
So you've got a diverse candidate applying to a nonprofit. Is that, yes. Did I hear that right?
Yes.
Okay. And so here's the challenge is going to be, how can I advance the business? Mm-hmm. Right? It's, you don't focus on, you don't focus on the identity, if you will. You focus on what you can bring, and you keep the conversation focused on what they can bring to the table.
I think that's great. Rick, from a job search perspective, certainly what I've seen over the last probably 6 months is this increase much more around the CSR topic, and companies requiring new competencies. So you as executives being able to tell the story. I love your examples because you were actually quantifying, right? Because we teach
yes.
people how to create their accomplishment statements, and you've actually gave us some great examples how to quantify that today with some data. And so maybe as people reflect back, even if you weren't particularly involved or leading these initiatives when you were in a role, reflect back and try to come up with some small tidbits of how you contributed to a metric. And certainly moving forward, these are, I think, going to be new, very important criteria for measurements for executives going into leadership roles.
And I appreciate that. It's funny because it even ties into the last presentation I gave to this audience is the company you want to work for really the company you want to work for? And we talked about some of these ideas. Now, the context has changed from a couple of years ago to today by virtue of just the events of the time, but the idea still remains the same. So I appreciate that connection. So, and you also led very well, Kathy, into the last slide here, and here's the call to action. So how will you take the lead in your company's internal conversation? Mm-hmm. The company is looking to the CFO to produce the so what in a quantified way, the ROI, call it whatever you want. So my challenge is, what will you do in the next 30 days to engage business leaders in your organization based on what's come out of, whatever notes you took out of this presentation? And just to help get you started, I mentioned at the very beginning that I'm part of the CSR committee for the Naperville Area Chamber of Commerce. And so last November, we created this toolkit. Now, it is currently missing the DEI chapter because our separate DEI committee is still working on it, but by the end of March, we will have that chapter as well. But this, we purposely structured this to say, here's the value, here's how you measure, here's how you can start the internal conversation, here's some of the questions you should really ask. And there's a couple of pages of resources across all 4 dimensions, or 3 of the 4 at this point, but also some resources around values and culture, because they play a very key role in the conversation. So I'll provide this slide to Susan, and she can distribute it out to everybody who's on the call, but that would give you a good place to start. Again, I've always appreciated the opportunity to speak to this audience. To echo Kathy's words, you've been very hospitable. It's been a lot of fun. I appreciate the great questions. If I can help clarify anything after the call, my contact information is here, and I'd be more than happy to continue the conversation offline.